Hi, I am Rachel Lane, and this is my final literature review for researching evidence-based models for practice intervention, SOWK 713. So I looked into restorative justice curriculum specifically within school settings to address racial disproportionality within suspension rates, specifically among Black students, and a lot of the research indicated a disproportionate amount of Black boys impacted in this way. So here is my rationale. Black and brown students within schools across the United States have experienced racism in the form of exclusionary practices. The disproportionate amount of students of color who have been removed temporarily from the school setting points to the discriminatory practices. Whether a student has been excluded from the school context once or numerous times, their lack of presence is indicative of damaged relationships with peers, as well as teachers, a stunted education, and a higher likelihood of delinquency. The following research discusses the importance of implementing restorative justice curricula into school as a remedy for the detrimental effects of exclusionary practices. Despite research offering context into restorative justice theory and its benefits, empirical literature is sparse concerning the practical implementation of the restorative justice approach, as well as the long-term impact of these practices. To further understand how restorative justice practices promote equity in schools, additional literature pertaining to the influence of intersectional identities, tangible application of the approach, and the randomized and longitudinal success of the intervention is needed. So another piece of information concerning the background behind why I chose this particular topic to research is my current field practicum is within a school setting, and I work with middle schoolers, and our student body demographic is predominantly students of color, with around 50% of our student body being Black and brown students. And um, I've witnessed firsthand different suspensions and exclusionary practices within our school setting, and I was curious about alternatives to these practices. And our social work team has been trying to implement restorative justice practices within our school for the past several years. Um, but our increase, but we needed an increase in knowledge and concerning the practical application of these restorative justice practices, as well as just what the research is saying regarding benefits and impacts. So that's a background for the literature review. So let's get into it. So we're talking about the background of discrimination in schools and the impact of this discrimination. On this slide, we're talking about racial disproportionality among suspension in schools. So to understand the discrimination present within schools requires a consideration of racial inequality within exclusionary practices, particularly suspensions and their long-term impacts. So trends in discipline show that the responses of school staff to subjective offenses are correlated with the race of the student in question. So basically expanding on this, the research states that white students are punished for objective offenses, whereas Black students are punished for subjective offenses, um, meaning that there is variability in how those offenses are perceived. Pairing subjective offenses with racial bias has led to racial disproportionality in the number of students receiving suspensions. Black boys in particular are acutely impacted by this prejudice, as Black boys made up 8% of the student population and 25% of who was suspended. However, higher exposure rates to punitive discipline extend beyond the experience of Black boys, as students of color, specifically the Latinx youth and members of that community have higher rates of suspension than white students due to subjective offenses. Consequently, students of color experience a disproportionate number of suspensions due to exclusionary discipline that is discriminatory in practice. Furthermore, students with intersecting identities, such as Black girls who experience discrimination due to their race and their gender, are exposed to higher rates of suspension than their white peers. A direct comparison between the discipline of white and Black girls states that Black girls are 6 times more likely than white girls to be suspended. The nuance of intersectional identities that leads to compounding discrimination results in unequal rates of exclusionary discipline in particular populations, such as Black girls, as mentioned before. Although knowledge of racial discrimination in disciplinary practices has been demonstrated in the literature and acknowledged in academic settings, further research on intersectionality to highlight injustice is required. Recognizing the racial gap in suspension rates, some schools have implemented alternatives to exclusionary discipline. However, a study found that schools who utilize alternatives when possible, such as restorative justice curricula, um, still have unequal suspension rates amongst their white students and their students of color. Although implementing restorative justice practices, in contrast to exclusionary discipline, may lessen racial inequality seen in suspensions, it does not eradicate the overrepresentation of Black and Brown students within these suspension rates. These findings suggest that long-term implementation of restorative justice curricula and repeated evaluation of practice effectiveness are needed to minimize discrimination within the school setting. Finally, research significance is seen when considering the lifelong ramifications of punitive discipline and its correlation to racial demographics. One study shows that a suspension at any age is attributed to a 50% increase in the likelihood of dropping out of high school. Moreover, suspensions and expulsions among students of color lead to higher rates of involvement with the juvenile justice system, which is ultimately linked to incarceration as an adult. Therefore, the overrepresentation of students of color in suspension rates is intimately related to the school to prison pipeline phenomenon. And the punitive discipline that our Black and Brown students receive at significantly higher rates parallels and leads to disproportionate rates of people of color within our criminal justice systems, which is seen in that school to prison pipeline. So now we will consider some historical and socio-cultural factors within our history of discrimination within schools. So, as schools reflect the broader societal ecosystem, schools inherently adopt the beliefs and norms that are held by dominant groups in society. So, consequently, society's perception of people of color as well as societal punishments for deviant behavior have been integrated into schools. So, considering students with intersecting identities, research indicates that Black girls are subject to a phenomenon called adultification, meaning Black girls, some as young as 5 years old, are viewed as older, more mature, and independent for their age than their white peers. This unethical practice lessens authoritative empathy for Black girls. So that could be like empathy from teachers or school staff, and prompts the usage of developmentally inappropriate interventions, as well as lessens the amount of support that they are given. In this way, Black girls are held to a maturity standard that exceeds their stage of development and goes beyond what is expected of their peers. Continuing to draw on these social structures, the use of suspension in schools is modeled after sequestration, which has been used to protect subjective normalcy. In the history of the United States, sequestration was used in a variety of settings, but each had the intention of separating an individual from the collective. Excuse me. A study articulating this history writes, in the country's early years, almshouses, poorhouses, prisons, hospitals, and insane asylums all served different purposes for their residents, but the same purpose for the public was to protect compliant people from the influences of the depraved and non-compliant. In the same way, suspension removes children from the learning environment as a consequence of their behavior, which results in a separation from peers and school staff. Studies that highlight these historical and sociocultural factors warn that simply removing the practices of adultification and sequestration are insufficient. Researcher Lutzik writes that the very beliefs that lead to such sequestration need to be challenged alongside the biases and institutional forces that more grandly marginalize students of color in schools. A confrontation of beliefs that lead to discriminatory practices can be bolstered by considering environmental and systemic factors that influence students. In a comprehensive statement, this study writes, adolescents' problem behaviors often develop from a complex interaction of their risk factors, developmental changes, and the environment in which they live. No individual or student is an island. We all exist within community, which means holistic interventions that focus on incorporation into the community and an age-appropriate environment are essential factors that contribute to student success. Now we will get into zero tolerance and exclusionary punishment history. So, mirroring sequestration, schools in the late 20th century began to implement zero tolerance policies, which mirrored the socio-political environment at the time. So, during the 1990s, the United States established the War on Drugs, a tough on crime stance that significantly impacted disciplinary measures in the school context. Following the implementation of zero tolerance policies in schools, the use of exclusionary practices increased, which resulted in the escalation of disciplinary measures. Zero tolerance and therefore exclusionary practices isolated students from their peers and decontextualized their behavior because of their immediate removal from the environment where the behavior occurred. The automatic disciplinary response of exclusion within schools mirrors the criminal justice system's response to subjectively deviant behavior. And similar to other frameworks and disciplinary approaches, the zero tolerance stance paralleled macro sociopolitical themes within a mesocontext. So the mesocontext would be the school. Now we'll move to the impact of zero tolerance policies. Despite the intention of zero tolerance policies to minimize the deviance and noncompliance of people, these practices simply ostracize students and increase discrimination. One of the most significant protective factors that was lost in the zero tolerance approach is the constant presence of healthy adult relationships. The severing of relationships with teachers and school staff via exclusionary discipline significantly alters a student's perception of whether they belong within their class, their school, and their community. A researcher writes, feelings of belonging are particularly important for youth of color who may face racialized, structural, and interpersonal discrimination in their quest to achieve academically and may need additional support to navigate and feel connected to their schools and their classrooms. Beyond jeopardizing relationships, zero tolerance policies have proven to be ineffective, as quantitative research indicates zero tolerance policies do not reduce discipline infractions and may instead alienate students from school altogether, leading to repeated disciplinary incidents and a higher likelihood of school dropout. Furthermore, the long-term impacts of zero tolerance and exclusionary practices are correlated with the school-to-prison pipeline, as mentioned earlier. Students who learn in a zero tolerance disciplinary system have an increased likelihood of grade retention, dropout, and future delinquency, which are all associated with future prison involvement. And consequently, the ramifications of zero tolerance policies can be seen in the short term via student exclusion and the long term through an increased propensity towards future delinquency, as mentioned earlier. Now, we'll move on to restorative justice. So this is the history of restorative justice. Just as zero tolerance policies and other discriminatory practices were modeled from social phenomena, restorative justice draws its influence from sociocultural traditions, blending inspiration from South Pacific, namely New Zealand, indigenous cultures with American ideologies. Restorative justice melds communal responsibility with independent choice. Pertaining to the influence of indigenous cultures, restorative justice curricula has drawn on ancient peacemaking traditions that were central to the functioning of these South Pacific indigenous communities. Traditions include storytelling and collective decision making, as well as circle ceremonies to prevent conflict, balance power, and resolve disputes. Drawing on these practices, restorative justice practices seek to prioritize in community the mitigating of harm, attending to the root causes of conflict, and fostering relationships, empathetic dialogue, and community accountability. Pairing Indigenous traditions with American ideologies to address current conflicts is the mission and purpose behind the development of restorative justice practices. Now, restorative justice defined. Expanding from its root in Indigenous traditions, restorative justice curricula prioritize collective well-being, holistic consideration of the individual, and an equalizing of power. Several articles note that a distinct difference between exclusionary and restorative disciplinary approaches is their shift from social control to working with students towards their communal well-being. The intentional incorporation of students into the restorative process also means students have responsibility for the reparation of harm that was caused and the relationships that were impacted by their behavior. Consequently, restorative justice in schools equips students with the skills to repair relationships as opposed to removing them from that social environment. Furthermore, restorative justice seeks to diminish power imbalances so that students and faculty alike have equal access to the collaborative process of restoration. In essence, restorative justice curricula emphasizes the importance of students with the school community, within the school community, and seeks to rebuild relationships with and amongst students for the sake of holistic well-being. Now, the implementation of restorative justice practices. Due to the many facets of these practices, there is not a single framework that can be applied to all schools. However, several broad models capture the intentions of restorative justice while accounting for proactive and reactive interventions. And one specific restorative approach used in schools is the circle method, which is drawn from the Indigenous communities, where peers, coworkers, and supervisors alike can gather in a variety of contexts to repair harms and address concerns in a communal space. Another example is the respect agreement, where students and staff collectively develop a set of goals and expectations to abide by for the sake of communal well-being. In addition, the letter writing activity allows for students to repair relationships in written communication, which gives them the opportunity to explore their emotions surrounding the circumstance. Beyond these specific practices, broader educational pursuits, such as implementing social-emotional learning into a home classroom, practicing mediation between peers, and providing mental health support, also model restorative justice values. And research indicates that schools who are committed to the process of restorative justice regularly utilize a variety of these interventions for the sake of a comprehensive restorative education. Through the implementation of these restorative justice practices, we see an increase in community and individual resilience, along with school-wide adaptability. So now we will move to the impact of restorative justice practices, and we'll jump into insight for effective implementation. So, through trial and error, practitioners determine how to effectively implement restorative justice in schools, regardless of the type of intervention that is utilized or blend of interventions. First, researchers recognize that the shift towards a restorative-based school structure takes resources and plenty of staff, luxuries that are not always available to under-resourced schools. Second, studies are showing that successful implementation of restorative justice practices in schools takes a minimum of 3 to 5 years, with some schools requiring closer to 7 years. One reason why restorative justice practice takes years to implement is due to the total systemic rebuilding that must take place for a school to truly be committed to the restorative justice process. Therefore, the third insight for implementation is that restorative justice cannot be an appendage to the traditional disciplinary system, but must be a school-wide replacement to the current disciplinary structures. Lastly, to maximize the relevance of restorative curricula, researchers posit that intersectional interventions that attend to identity, power, and privilege are relevant and necessary to the act of meeting students' and staff needs. Despite variations in restorative interventions, it is important that schools have awareness of the time, commitment, systemic transformation, and whole person consideration that is required for effective restorative justice implementation. Now, the benefits of restorative justice, which we'll get into. Even within the variety of restorative justice practices, research indicates that the longitudinal benefits of restorative interventions are significant and notable. One study speaks to these benefits in stating, restorative justice contributes to meaningful changes in both school culture and disciplinary responses. It fosters communication and accountability. It promotes empathy, social emotional learning, and conflict resolution, which is a pretty notable list. Some of the most notable benefits of restorative justice curricula can be seen in the repairing of peer relationships. This benefit can be attributed to the intentional avoidance of student removal as a form of discipline and the commitment to communal well-being as seen in these interventions. Additionally, research notes that the strength of restorative justice is found in its complete rewriting of the disciplinary narrative from zero tolerance approaches. Counter to zero tolerance approaches, restorative justice interventions are developmentally appropriate for children and prioritize the cultivation of inclusive and healthy communities. Lastly, research notes that restorative justice practice has a unique capacity to address the complex interaction of risk factors that underlie adolescence. And therefore, restorative justice is effective due to its prioritization of community health alongside its attention to the realities of people's lived experiences. Now we will cover the unintended consequences of restorative justice curriculums. So, restorative justice has numerous benefits pertaining to healthier peer relationships and fostering a greater sense of belonging, but like any intervention, it has its ramifications. First and most notably, research showcases that most restorative justice curricula fail to close the discriminatory gap of exclusionary discipline practices between Black and white students. Secondly, researchers raise alarm about the unintentional sequestration of students who are engaged in restorative practices, meaning the structure of restorative justice interventions, such as a circle, still results in the exclusion of a student or students from their peers, which jeopardizes the whole goal of the intervention. Thirdly, several researchers warn that restorative justice interventions must replace exclusionary practices and stay grounded in restorative theory to ensure that diluted or inaccurate interventions are avoided. So in summary, restorative justice practices fail to eradicate racial inequalities or completely alter exclusionary discipline, and instead they run the risk of an inaccurate popularization of restorative justice theory. Now we will move on to gaps in the literature. So first, we're going to look at gaps in practically defining restorative interventions. Despite theoretical support for restorative justice practices in schools, empirical research surrounding the effectiveness of particular interventions is substantially lacking. One researcher articulates this by stating readers looking to learn more about restorative practices may encounter little difficulty in learning of the restorative justice philosophy, but substantial difficulty in identifying and analyzing the specific practices to be implemented in accordance with this philosophy. Furthermore, the same article states that measurable designs, specifically quantitative in nature, are especially sparse, which vastly limits its generalizability. The ambiguity surrounding the actual effectiveness of restorative justice curricula causes confusion regarding how to implement restorative justice interventions while ensuring that they are still evidence-based. Now we'll move to, once again, gaps in the literature, but gaps in who is included within these studies. Further limitations to research include the lack of diverse narratives considered in restorative justice research. Several studies point to the necessity of interdisciplinary input within the research and a diversification of voice that moves beyond the therapeutic and social work professions. One study goes on further to say that the vast implementation of restorative justice curricula has exceeded the current research, and that the existing research rarely contains student feedback. Furthermore, the same study revealed a need for increased research amongst students of color with intersectional identities who are impacted by disciplinary exclusion. An example of this could be Black girls. The addition of interdisciplinary voices as well as student narratives that represent the student bodies in restorative justice literature would help contextualize the effectiveness of these restorative practices. Finally, we have gaps in study design and length. So, beyond refining who is included in the research and defining what is being studied, restorative justice literature can increase their design variety and length. As noted earlier, the benefits of restorative justice interventions cannot be seen in school settings until numerous years have passed, which indicates a need for more longitudinal research designs. Building upon a longitudinal study, there is also a gap in process-oriented restorative justice research, as most studies focus on student outcomes or meta theory concerning restorative justice. There's a big lack in practical implementation. One author offers that it is imperative to invest in well-designed experimental, i.e., cluster randomized trials that rigorously establish evidence, or effectiveness evidence or identify the lack of evidence. Diversifying research in these ways will strengthen the application of restorative justice through increasing reliability and generalizability. In summation, longitudinal designs and diverse samples are needed for proper evaluation of restorative justice outcomes in the present for the purpose of successful long-term implementation. We want to know how to implement these long-term, the benefits, the drawbacks, and what we can work on. Here is my works cited, and thank you for watching.